Great Ideas is a program devoted to uncovering the meaning of the ideas we all use every day of our lives. In the period to follow, Dr. Mortimer J. Adler will undertake to discuss some aspect of a basic idea. Dr. Adler.
Good afternoon. Before we begin the discussion of another great idea, that of labor or human work, this afternoon, I would like to tell you that Mr. Luckman and I were both surprised as well as pleased by the character of the questions we received this week. Lloyd, you recall that last week we were concerned as to whether we were going to get questions that dealt with labor in a manner that fitted the discussion we wanted to have. We were afraid that the most obvious questions that might arise in your mind about labor would be questions about such things as labor versus capital, or the organization of labor unions, or the division of labor, or the labor theory of value, or labor as the right to property. Now, all these matters are important aspects of the idea of labor, but we want to discuss in these 4 Sundays the idea of labor from another point of view. We want to be concerned with the nature and necessity of work in human life. We are interested in the relation of work to other kinds of activity. Above all, we want to understand the variety, the different kinds of work, and to see that variety in relation to the great and central problem of the fundamental dignity of all human labor. And these questions we receive, Lloyd, I think, help us to discuss labor from this point of view. Let me outline, so that you have them before you, let me outline the topics we will pursue in the 4 Sundays of January as we consider the great idea of labor. This afternoon, we are going to discuss the parts of human life, and particularly the part that work or labor plays in a human life. And then next Sunday, we shall deal with labor or work in relation to 2 other things, play on the one hand and leisure on the other, and we shall be concerned with how play and leisure are different. Then, in the 3rd Sunday of the month, I'm very anxious to talk about all the different kinds of work there are. Menial work and servile work and work that has dignity and meaning. And finally, in the last Sunday of the month, in the light of the understanding we shall have achieved by then, I hope, concerning labor and leisure, I would like to deal with some moral, political, and economic consequences of the understanding we have achieved. Now, this afternoon, I would like to begin with the question about the parts of the human life. What does the question itself mean? What does it mean to ask what are the parts of a human life? Well, in the first place, let's consider for a moment what one means by a human life. Normally, I think, one means a span of time in which there is a regular rhythm of activities, a clear pattern of development. And as one looks at a human life this way, one cannot help but recalling Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man. Well, 7 is too many for me this afternoon. I'd like to deal with 3 ages of man, 3 great periods of human life. Infancy or childhood at one end, senility or old age at the other, and in between that long period I shall simply call maturity, without distinguishing between youth and middle age. Now, I think it's extraordinarily interesting. I hope you see the point too, the same way, that in these 3 periods, only one is the working period of human life. We don't expect infants or children to work. We don't expect old people to work after they have worked the major part of their lives. And the middle part, the long middle period of human life, I want to call the working period. It is distinguished by the fact that men and women are expected to work during this period of their lives. Now, how do we use our time? How should we use our time during this long working period of our lives? To that question, the average American citizen in the 20th century has almost a standard answer. Here it is. He says, the time of my life, the days of my week, the weeks of my year, or month and then year, are regularly divided in the following way. Take a 24-hour day. Let this line represent 24 hours. And then in about equal thirds, the average American says, I devote 8 hours to sleep, 8 hours to work, and I have 8 hours approximately, day after day, left over for free time. And the word free here, as applied to that last third of time, means time free from sleep and work. It is the unoccupied time. Now, the average American, when he gives this answer, if he were then asked, how do you fill that free time? What do you do with that free time? Would say, in 1 of 3 words, play, I amuse myself, I indulge in recreation, or I use it for leisure activities, or I use it for rest. And the average American today would use those 3 words, play, leisure, and rest, as if they meant the same thing as filling for free time. Now I want to comment on this answer. There are 2 things I want to say about this answer which the average American citizen gives to this question in the 20th century. In the first place, I want you to understand, terribly important for all of us to understand, that this answer is an answer that belongs to an industrial, democratic society. It was never given by men before. To make this point clear, let me compare the life of an average American citizen in the industrial democracy of the United States today with all the pre-industrial aristocratic societies of the past, whether they be those of our own colonial times in this country, or those of the feudal societies of Europe, or the time of ancient antiquity in Greece and Rome. In all those pre-industrial aristocratic societies of the past, men were divided in the first place, men were divided into 2 classes. They either were slaves or artisans, they belonged to the working class, or they were free men. They belonged to the leisure class. And of course, these were the many, and these were the few. Now, each of these 2 classes of men had a 2-part life, not a 3-part life. The average American today has a 3-part life, sleep, work, and free time. But the slaves of all the societies of the pre-industrial past had only two parts. They worked and they slept. Work and sleep occupied their time in almost equal halves, and there's a little saving remnant there, against which I'm putting a question mark. Just a little time left over in the whole week, from 12 or 14 hours of work and 12 hours of sleep, to get over that, the fatigues of toil. And perhaps there was a day off once in a while, or an hour off once in a while. Let's hold that open. For the most part, the slaves and working class of all the pre-industrial societies of the past had a two-part life, half work, half sleep. And in those same societies, there was another class of men, the free men, the class we call the leisure class. And they also had a two-part life. They slept. And they didn't need to sleep as much because they didn't work. They slept, they had some sleep, and the rest of their time was free time. They had a two-part life. They didn't work. They had, by accumulated wealth or the work of slaves and others, freedom from labor. Their life divided into two parts, not equal parts, about a third of sleep and two-thirds free time. Now that doesn't tell the whole story, because I must add one more thing to that. I must point out that in this leisure class, there were two kinds of men. There were the useful citizens, the men who, though they were free from work, occupied their time well in activities that were contributed to human welfare and activities which ennobled and improved themselves. These men were virtuous. But in this same class of free men who had leisure, there were, in every society of the past, the men that we would call the wastrels, the playboys, the prodigals, who spent this free time not in leisure activities, but in play or diversion, often of a degrading kind. In fact, the meaning of the word sloth, the cardinal sin or vice of sloth, means the misuse of this free time, not by sleeping, but by playing it away, killing it, frittering it away. As a matter of fact, you can say it one other way. Children have this kind of a life. They sleep and use their free time for play. And when an adult human being lives this kind of a life, sleeps and uses the rest of his time for play, he is acting childishly. Now, what these diagrams show, then, is that the average American citizen's three-part life of today combines, puts together the parts that were separate in all the pre-industrial societies of the past, when slaves worked and slept, and free men were free men because, apart from sleeping, their time was free. And so you see, if it is possible, which I'm not sure we can understand fully yet today, to distinguish between play, leisure, and rest, we may be able to see how human life can have not just these three parts, but four parts or five parts, including sleep and work, play, leisure, and rest. Let me show you them over here for a moment. Here are the possible five parts of a human life: sleep, play, labor, leisure, and rest.
Dr. Adler?
Yes, Lloyd.
Now that we have these five things before us to consider, I think we're ready to take up one of the questions that we've received. It comes from Robert B. McPherson in Palo Alto. And it's a very simple and direct question. He says, what importance in the scale of values should one assign to work?
Well, there are several answers to that question, Lloyd. In fact, the two diagrams I put on the board indicate at least two. In all of the pre-industrial aristocratic societies of the past, Mr. McPherson, work was degrading. In all such societies, the ideal of the free man, the ideal of life, was a life free from or exempt from work. In fact, the ideal of freedom from work, having no work to do, has been a persistent ideal throughout the whole of human history. Let me read you some passages from the great books that bear directly on that matter. Lucretius, an ancient Roman poet, pictured a golden age of abundance and plenty in which men could live well without any labor whatsoever. And a modern French political philosopher and economist, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, describes the golden age as a time when the produce of the earth furnished man with all he needed, and instinct told him how to use it, so that singing and dancing, the true offspring of love and leisure, became the amusement, or rather the occupation, of men and women assembled together with nothing else to do. Again, Virgil describes two ages of man, the age of Kronos, in which there was no need for work at all, and the age of Jupiter or Jove, when man is care-ridden and burdened with toil. And if you think a moment, Lloyd, in the tradition, the Christian tradition, the story of Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden is a story of the transition from that perfect paradise on earth in which Adam and Eve and all their descendants would have lived without any labor at all off the fruits of the tree, out into the world where the angel who puts Adam out says to him, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat, in toil shalt thou eat all the days of thy life." So much for the answer to Mr. McPherson's question as it would be given in the past. But in the America of today, Lloyd, it seems to me there are two possible other answers. In our industrial society in the 20th century, if the free third of our time is mainly play or amusement, then I think the answer should be that work is the most important part of human life, because no adult can possibly say that he lives in order to play. On the other hand, if the free third of our three-part life is not play or amusement, but leisure activities, then I would say the opposite, Lloyd, Mr. McPherson. I would say that work is subordinate to leisure, and that in proportion as we understand the relation of work to leisure, we perceive a scale in the kinds or types of work. Now, I don't think, Lloyd, that I can make all this clear today without much more clarification of the distinction between leisure and play than we have time for now. In fact, this becomes the most important part of our discussion next week, and very important indeed, because it is my impression that in America today, the notion of leisure is almost everywhere confused with that of play or amusement, recreation or diversion. And I'm going to try to show next week that it's almost the very opposite. But before I do that, I want to discuss one very special notion that I've enumerated on the blackboard that I think stands out from all the rest and which we should deal with quickly and put it aside. And that is the notion, Lloyd, of rest. And to make the point about rest that I want to make clear, let me remind you of two biblical texts that I think you are all quite familiar with. One is the text from Genesis, and the other is a text from Exodus. Let me read you the text from Genesis first. The text from Genesis reads, "And on the seventh day, God ended his work, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all his work." Now, I'm sure we all understand that when it says in Genesis that God rested from all his work, it doesn't mean that God slept or that God played. Now then, following that text, there's a very closely related text in Exodus. It's the text that is in one of the Ten Commandments. It reads as follows: "Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath." And by the way, the word Sabbath in Hebrew means simply cessation, cessation from work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, and in it thou shalt do no work, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor the stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Again, it's perfectly clear, is it not, that what the Old Testament means by sabbatical rest, keeping this day holy, hallowing it, doesn't mean something that can be done by sleeping all the Sabbath or playing all the Sabbath. What does rest mean, as used in the Old Testament when it talks about God resting or men resting on the seventh day? I think, in the first place, it means not merely rest against work in our sense, but that distinction of rest as against work means rest as against all other normal, natural, everyday human activity, including sleep and play and leisure activities. For if resting on the Sabbath means keeping it holy, then the only thing it seems that the Old Testament could have in mind is religious worship on the Sabbath, the contemplation of God and the glorification of God. And this, I think, is the meaning of the phrase we all know and use, the phrase heavenly rest. There is no work in heaven, there is no sleep in heaven, and the rest of the souls who are among the saints is a rest of the contemplation of God. Now, if this is what the word rest means, then rest divides human life into two planes, a religious plane and a secular plane, a supernatural plane and a natural plane. And any life can be on two planes, and our problem for the rest of these discussions of labor is a problem about the division of the time of the natural plane. And there it would seem as if there could be 3 or 4 parts to human life. On the natural plane, it could be either just understood as sleep, work, and free time, confusing play and leisure, or sleep, work, and play and leisure quite distinct from play. The question then we face is, should we live? Do we live a 3-part or a 4-part life?
Dr. Adler?
Yes, Lloyd.
I have a question on that very point, and it comes from Donald Mills, who lives in San Francisco. I think Mr. Mills would admit that labor is distinct from sleep and play, but he asks further, is it necessary to distinguish between labor and leisure? Isn't it possible that they're the same thing, provided that the general term labor includes different kinds of labor activity?
Well, Lloyd, I think that Mr. Mills, in a sense, gives himself gives part of the answer to the question he asked.
True.
He admits, as you say, that sleep and play are different from work. And I think if we can see that sleep and play are different from work, we shall also be able to see that leisure is also different from work or labor. How do sleep and work differ? Very simply. Sleep is inactivity. Or if we include in sleep such things as eating and cleansing the body, all the biological activities which, like sleep, sustain life, then sleep is either inactivity or merely biological activity, whereas work is distinctly human activity. How do play and work differ? Well, I think Mr. Mills would know and recognize and agree that the difference between play and work is, I'm not going to explain the whole difference, but it's caught by one extraordinary sign. We do not get paid for play. No one expects to be compensated for play, and no one in his right mind would work without compensation. Just think of that for a moment. We do not get paid and don't expect to get paid, salaries or wages or anything else, for playing. We do for work. So both are human activities. Play is uncompensated. Work must be compensated in any fair or free society. Now, according to this distinction, that all of our free time, whether we play or, in distinction from play, use it for leisure, which I should like to have quite separate from play, is a kind of human activity, not like sleep, inactivity or mere biological activity, a kind of human activity which we do without any thought of compensation. Hence, with this preliminary distinction of work, play, and recreation, our problem remains mainly one of understanding how in the free part of our time, play or recreation on the one hand is distinguished from leisure on the other. And as we make this distinction, as we solve this problem, the character and significance of work will be greatly affected. Now, this is the problem for next time, Lloyd, the problem of understanding labor, leisure, and play. Do we have time for one more question now?
Well, I hope we do, because just as you've announced the problem for next time, I think I have a question which we could read as a closing for today's discussion and also as a bridge to next week.
That would be very helpful indeed.
It comes from Mr. Angus Babcock in Menlo Park, and it reads, "There is one angle to the subject of labor, Dr. Adler, which I would enjoy hearing you discuss. I accept the theory that the conservation of human energy and the division of labor creates leisure. We have now reached a stage in which most of the manual tasks have been taken over by machines, and specialization has been added to the division of labor. Yet it seems to me that the family of 50 years ago knew more leisure than the push-button family of today. The half hour of leisure time we Babcock spend watching your TV show is most enjoyable. But another half hour of cracker barrel chat among friends and relatives, which should follow upon your show, is just a utopian wish. I regret the lack of time to discuss, digest, assimilate the ideas that are born of such projects." And that's the question.
I am most grateful to you, Mr. Babcock, for that question and for the kind words you have to say about this program. I'm glad, I'm sure you are too, Lloyd, that Mr. Babcock regards watching this program as a use of leisure, not as either work or amusement, and I certainly hope not as sleep. And you know, as a matter of fact, Lloyd, it would be a hard question for us to answer. When we're on this program, are we working or are we engaging in leisure activity? Now, if we could keep quiet about anything in the way of compensation we get for this, I would like to say that Mr. Fluckman and I regard this as not play, not work, but as a rather interesting and exciting form of leisure. Now, the other aspect of Mr. Babcock's question, I'd like to mention or just deal with briefly now and then come back to next time. The lack of time you complain about, Mr. Babcock. The lack of time must mean that play or recreation or amusements of some kind, not work, has swallowed up too much of all our free time. The trouble with life in America in the 20th century is not that we work too much, but that our free time is too much engaged in play and amusement, so that too little of it is left, as you point out, Mr. Babcock, for the kind of leisure activities that really are the most profitable part of human life. To make that point quite clear, next week we will try to get leisure and play as distinct as possible in relation to work. I hope you will all send again. I can persuade you to send the excellent questions of the sort that we've been receiving in the last few weeks, questions about labor, play, and leisure. Thank you very much.